Welcome everybody here. It's so great to be here. It's so great to see you all. Great to see you every month. Get used to it just for the next 2 months. And then we're going to go for a long spell in between. Maybe we'll have to do some other things in between to meet up. I want to just thank you all for coming. Siyum Masechet Ta'anit. I want to thank our sponsors. It's sponsored by Rella Feldman and family in honor of all the Daf Yomi learners internationally and the dedicated teachers who make it possible. Thank you to Rabbanit Michelle for your daily inspiration and to Ilana Kurshan for your shiur today and the other shiur that we'll hear from Catriella. And I want to just add a mazel tov to Rella personally for the engagement of Talia and Gavi, Talia Agus and Gavi Weiss, mazel tov. And the Siyum is also sponsored by Sarah Averick and Jose Rosenfeld in loving memory of Leah and Nathan Averick and Rachel and Walter Mark. So thank you to our sponsors. And we're going to start learning. We're going to learn the last daf. It's a very short daf, so this part is going to be a little bit shorter than usual. And then we'll hear from our other speakers. So I want to go back a little bit in case someone didn't do the last daf or someone here isn't finishing the Masechet, which I hope there are some of you who are joining just to be part of this wonderful Siyum Masechet. I want to just say that Ta'anit was a Masechet that we had a lot of new people that joined, and it's very exciting to have you with us. So if this is your first Siyum, Mazal Tov to you. And I also want to point out that we are 2 years on the Hebrew calendar from the Siyum HaShas. So anyone who started at the Siyum HaShas, you are now exactly 2 years into it, which is really an amazing feat. Okay, let's get started. We end our Masechet, which, as I've mentioned many times in class, we kept talking about this tza'al and the difficulties and the struggles. And it's really a Masechet full of struggles and attempts to connect with God and to bring the rain and all sorts of calamities that might happen. And we end the Masechet on a very high note, on a note of happiness and days that were the best days of the year. Okay, so we kind of end before that with Tisha B'Av, which we know is this one of the saddest days of the year. We talked all about in the past shiur about Avelut, about it's like a day of mourning. And then we end on this nice note about Lo hayu yamim tovim liYisrael ka-15 b'Av ki Yom HaKippurim. And really, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying is he's reminiscing about what was. At a certain point, they used to celebrate this day. And we say, okay, Yom Kippur, we understand it's a day of atonement. We get atoned for, but what is this Tu B'Av? What is this 15th of Av? And we're going to have all sorts of strange answers that we already went through most of them. So I'll just kind of summarize them. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, it was the day that anytime a woman would, it's interesting, we end with about women and inheritance, where women would inherit the property from her father. It's a day that originally, they were told, the Benot Slavcha, that they could only marry within their tribe. And it was a day that all of a sudden everyone could go back to what it originally was, that anyone could marry anyone. And if you inherited land, you'd still be able to be part of someone else's, marry into some other tribe. Then we said the next thing, and it was taught by a drasha of the rabbis that they figured out a way to darshan this. The next thing was Shevet Binyamin. There was the civil war at the end of the time of Judges. And at the end of the Civil War, they basically say, well, no one can marry anyone from Binyamin's family. And again, Tu B'Av is the day where that was repealed. So those two are very similar. The next one is Yom Shekalu Bo Mitei Midbar. The people in the desert who were all decreed after the sin of the spies, they all finished dying on that day. That was the end of the decree on Tu B'Av. And we went through the Rashi already. I'm not going to go back there. The next one we had was Yom Shebitel Hoshea ben Elah plus Diot Shoshiv Yeravam ben Nevat. Yeravam basically put these borders up, didn't want people, so the Israelite kingdom didn't want people going to the temple. And he basically said, this is it, nobody's allowed to go. And the last king of Israel said, I'm going to get rid of this. It's very interesting. The Yerushalmi, where the Yerushalmi questions, on Ta'anit right here, where the Yerushalmi questions and says something doesn't make sense here. If he was the last king, what does that mean? It means that the Assyrians came in his time and basically kicked everybody out of the land. So if he was so good that he basically removed this barrier, then why did the destruction come, right? It seems like a little bit of a strange thing. So the Yerushalmi answers that something very interesting. The Yerushalmi says what he did was he removed the barriers and he took the responsibility off his shoulders and put it on their shoulders. And he basically said, do what you want now. Okay, I'm done. I opened the barriers. He didn't say, I want you all to go to Jerusalem. if he had done that and been a real leader and stood up and said, this is what I want you to do, he might have been able to change things. And that's amazing to think about, because that was the end of the Israelite kingdom, which was this very strong kingdom. And that was the end. And he had the power to do that, and he didn't. Okay, we'll get back to this idea about having the power to change things and not. So he did change something, but he was lacking. Okay, next. Now we're going to get to the parts you didn't see. Rav Matna Amar. We're now starting at the top of Tanit Lamed Aleph. Rav Matna Amar Yom Shenitnu Harugei Beitar Lekvura. This was in the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and all the people in Beitar were killed, and then they weren't allowed to be buried. It was really torturous for the people not to be able to bury their dead. Va'amar Rav Matna Oto Yom Shenitnu Harugei Beitar Lekvura Tiknu B'Yavna Hatov V'Hametiv. That's the bracha we say in Birkat Hamazon. We actually learned this already. I believe it was in Masechet Brachot, that on that day where they were then allowed finally to bury them, they instituted the blessing, the fourth blessing in of Hatov V'Hametiv in benching. Hatov shelo esrichu v'Hametiv shenitnu lekfura. Hatov, thank God on the good, which is that their bodies didn't rot, and Hametiv, that they were actually brought to burial. Okay, those are two things that we thank God for. And that was another thing that possibly happened on Tu B'Av. The next and last thing is Rabba v'Rabbi Yosef ta'amrei tzchavayu. This I would say is a little bit different than all the others. Yom shepasku milechrot etzim l'ma'aracha. We had a whole discussion about all these people who brought wood to the temple. Well, this was the day where they would stop. If you remember, there was a whole huge number of days that people brought in the month of Av. It seems a little bit strange. Maybe we get a clue and an answer to this question in this source. It was the day where they stopped cutting wood for it. Now, there were some people who still brought wood after that, but they wouldn't cut any wood after that. Why? What makes this day unique? Okay, we just celebrated the holiday of Hanukkah. And one of the sources that talks about Hanukkah is what happened in Hanukkah, not the miracle of Hanukkah, but that when there's a source that people connect to Hanukkah, which is Adam HaRishon, when he gets to the first year of living, and all of a sudden he sees that the days are getting darker and darker, and then all of a sudden, right, the days start to get longer right around Hanukkah time, and that's the hope he has. So here it's the reverse. This is the opposite. In the summer, at Tu B'Av, that's when the days start to get shorter. And what does that mean? It means, we're going to see it right now inside, that the sun is not as strong. How does this connect with cutting the wood? You'll see in a minute. Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol Omer, so we quote a Braita to explain this. The sun starts to get less strong. If they don't dry out properly, because the sun's not strong enough, then they could get worm infested, and then that makes it incapable of using them for the temple. So therefore, they wouldn't allow any cutting of this from that point on. It's almost interesting, because what does it mean? It means the rainy season is on its way, which is really what our Masechet is all about. Not yet, but we are starting to get to the point where the days are getting shorter. And now the Gemara adds in this extra thing, which is Amar Rav Menashe v'karle Yom Tavar Magal. Okay, the first thing they say is they call it the day of breaking the Magal. The Magal is a sickle, so they call it the day of breaking the sickle because you no longer need it, because you can't cut the wood anymore. But Mikam va'elach, now the Gemara adds this interesting line: De mosif yosif u'de mosif ye'asef. This is a clear play on words. One who's mosif, who adds. Now, what happens in those days? If there's no light, right? If it's night, it gets dark earlier. So what happens? There's less daytime, really, and there's less time to do things because it's all dark outside. So comes the Gemara, and it says here something fascinating. It says, if you add time to learn in the nighttime when it's harder to learn, but light your candles and learn anyway. Don't think that just because the day starts to get shorter that you should end your day earlier. No, you should be productive all day long, even during the nighttime. So someone who's mosif, who adds Torah learning to one's schedule, will add to their lives, okay? We'll add days to their lives. We'll get back to this at the very end of the Siyum today. I want to add something about it, but we'll stick with this for now. Udilo mosif, and if you don't add on any learning, Ye'asef, you will be collected. What does that mean? It means you will die early, right? We had that actually earlier in the Masechet about someone who was Ye'asef. So then, right, it was the curse that remember Rabbi Yossi Min Yodfat, I think, right, was his name, that he put on his curse on his children, that Ye'asef, one of them. Anyway, So if you don't add any learning into your schedule, when the days get shorter and you don't learn into the night, well, you will find a bad end to your life. And my Yasef, the Gemara says, what is this Yasef? Some people say, what do you mean? Everybody knows what Yasef is. Maybe it means a little, maybe it just means what will happen to you? Rav Yosef, tikberei imeh, your mother will bury you, right? A very tragic, right? When mothers have to bury their children. Interesting, they go back to the women again. I want to, before we finish the end of the Masechet, I just want to say something about these 6 ideas about what happens on Tu B'Av and what really is this idea and how did they get to this date of Tu B'Av, right? None of this has any basis in any sort of text or anything like that. So the one similarity that I came up with all these cases are all cases where something reverts back to its original state because of something somebody does. Okay, another, right, the Shvatim weren't allowed to, right? We're told they can't marry anyone in a different Shevet, and now we revert back to what it was, and we allow them to. B'nai Binyamin used to be able to marry everyone, they decreed no. Okay, the Mitei Midbar, right? Everyone was living fine until the decree came, and then the decree ends. Goes back to what it originally was, that people don't die all the time. And then Yeravam ben Nevad puts up this border, and then it's taken away. And Harugei Beitar, right? The norm is people get buried when they die. And here it's not within the norm. And then the last thing is actually because it's a natural phenomenon, which goes back to what it was before. So we basically have, and I think it's really the theme and something we've discussed throughout this Masechet, which is I always go back to that line about it's not your fast I'm looking for, it's not your sacks, it's your ma'asim. And that we all have the power to change, right? We can change. We have it within our control. And I think that that's one major theme that comes out of here, which is these are all things that we can change. The other thing, Rabbanit Shimoni and Gefet, which went up just a few hours ago on the site, if you didn't hear it, you can listen. One of the things she mentions in her shiur is fascinating. She says, all of these things are happy, but yet they're bittersweet. Right? Let's start with Harugei Beitar. That's really bittersweet, right? And they all die, but yet we're at least happy that we got to bury them. Okay, right? The borders get open, but the people still don't go to the temple. And the people, there were all sorts of bad things that had to happen for these events. Maybe B'not Tzlach had a little bit less so. But most of them are somewhat bittersweet. And I was thinking that it's really a message. You could take from here a very important message on why Tu B'Av. Because Tu B'Av comes right after Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is our saddest day of the year. And here we come and we say, yes, we had this terrible destruction. And remember, there was that opinion that the whole month of Av should be a month of mourning. And this is against that approach. And this is, no. You had your time of mourning. We even give you a week, right? A week after. And then we say, Tu B'Av, time to celebrate what we have. And it's time to appreciate, right? We all know that everybody has hard times, good times, all of the mix of everything almost often going on all at the same time. And the idea is, yes, to be in your struggle and understand that things aren't great, but to break out of that and say, appreciate the good things you have. And I think that that's the idea of Tu B'Av coming right on the head, right after Tisha B'Av, to basically say, move on. And this is our cycle of life. And you have to celebrate. And that's why it becomes this Yom Tov, because once you celebrate the sad and you've gotten through it, you can then really celebrate the good and appreciate what you have. So I think that's a nice idea that comes out at the end of this Masechet, which is all about really people struggling and having all sorts of internal struggles. Okay, let's finish up the daf now. Shebahen Benot Yerushalayim. Now we get to this strange thing about the Benot Yerushalayim that go out and dance, and then the boys come and they kind of pick them up and pick them out. And now we saw a few things about how they would each loan each other clothing. So the Gemara says, quotes a Braita, Tanu Rabbanan, Bat Melech sho'elet mi bat Kohen Gadol. Bat Kohen Gadol mi bat Skan, ubat Skan mi bat Kohen Mashuach Milchama. Mi bat Mashuach Milchama. This is sounding like Yoma, if you remember. So the daughter of the king borrows from the Kohen Gadol, and the daughter of the Kohen Gadol borrows from the daughter of the second in command to the Kohen Gadol, and the daughter of the second in command borrows from the daughter of the Kohen who goes out to tell everyone about the milchama, that we're going to have a war. And and then if you remember this, he says, right, anyone who's fearful and anyone who just got married doesn't have to go out to war. That's the mashuach milchama. Uba mashuach milchama mibat Kohen Hediot. She borrows from the Kohen Hediot. By the way, someone pointed out, one of the commentaries, I forgot who it was, that usually it's the reverse. Usually you borrow from someone who has higher status than you. And in this case, it's the reverse. That's just one interesting point. But I wanted to make a different point. And then it says, once we're done with all the hierarchy, then we just say, and everybody borrows from everybody else. And I think what this is saying is something interesting. It's not saying that there's no hierarchy. It is. There's a hierarchy. But in the end, it's saying that the strength is in the community, though, right? We still maintain this hierarchy, but in the end, and it's really what the Masechet, the message of our Masechet was all along, which is it's all about the community getting together and working toward a common goal. And it was the simple people that were almost took on more importance than the important people. So here we have the important people, but then we get to everybody else, and they're kind of in the same category almost. We recognize as a hierarchy, but we also understand that for certain things, the hierarchy somewhat disappears. There's a bit of a non sequitur. They have to put their stuff in the mikveh, all their clothing, because it could be they were in nida and then they were impure, and they don't want other people to be wearing their impure clothing. Even if you haven't used them in a really long time and they were folded up in a box, right? I think like at the bottom of your closet, you still have to do it. So the Braita says again, they keep quoting Braito Tana, anyone who's unmarried goes to there. We had that in the Gemara in the Mishnah. Now we're going to read it inside in a Braita. Tanu Rabbanit. Just like we had a hierarchy, we had the king, the Kohen Gadol, etc. Now we're going to have this hierarchy among the women. Okay, there's women who are miyuchasot, they come from a good family. So what would they say? Or here they're starting with the yefefiyot, the beautiful ones. Right? The opposite of sheker achem behevel leyofi, right? If they're beautiful, they say, oh, you're beautiful, right? It's always a big question with girls, is it okay to compliment a woman and say she's beautiful, but we don't want to be looked at for our looks, and on the other hand, people do appreciate getting compliments about their looks. So to a certain extent, that's almost what they're saying. Well, if you're beautiful, then it's okay to talk about your beauty. What about the ones that had good lineage? And the point is, but they weren't so as beautiful. Okay, you might be, what do you mean? Women are only there for their sons. Rashi says, by the way, daughters also. It's just an interesting point that Rashi adds that. It says they mean here children in general. He adds sons and daughters. Still, I think, we don't think that that's the only purpose of women, but they're saying the point is this we always say, right? Marry someone from a good family because it means she'll be able to raise good children. But what about mechoarot shebehen? We had all those stories about the ugly people. So it's interesting that this theme comes up again. Okay, take her for the sake of heaven. This, I think, is very interesting, right? As long as you dress her up in gold, in other words, right, this is like someone who does a makeover, right? She would say, I could take anyone and make you look beautiful, right? And that's, I think the idea here is, again, it's the same theme. Anyone, you can work on something and you can change it, right? It's in our power to change anything. So even if you think you look ugly, there's a way to make you look beautiful also. And this is another way of sort of equalizing everybody, right? They want to get everyone on equal ground. They're all borrowing clothing. They're all this, right? So that we can function within a community when everyone's treated fairly and everyone's appreciated for what they have. The very last line of our Masechet, in the future, God will make a circle. It's very interesting. It's connected with the circle of the dancing of the women, but it's also connected with Honi ha-Magel, which we're going to hear about later from Catriella Freedman about this circle. Now, what was different? Honi went into the circle alone. In this circle, what do we have? We have tzaddikim, and God is sitting among them in Gan Eden. Everybody points to God, saying, this is God. This is what we've been waiting for all along. This is God that we've been waiting for. We should rejoice in his salvation. And what do you see here? This beautiful, beautiful idea after this whole Masechet. And I want to quote Ayelet Libson, who, if you haven't listened yet, her intro to Megillah is already up on the site. Recommended listening. Her intro into Ta'anit, she talked about this connection between God and man and how the rain is our way of connecting. And it's this beautiful passage in the end. What this is basically saying is there's going to come a time where we're going to see God bigaloi, really right in front of us, revealed in front of us, at least the tzaddikim will merit to see it. And after this whole Masechet of kind of searching for God in the rain, it ends with this beautiful idea that in the future, it's going to be much more clear. We're going to see God in a much more clear manner. And with that, Hadran ach b'shosha prakim, uslika la Masechet Ta'anit. We will say the Hadrans now together. And I will pull it up on the screen. And here it goes. Hadran alach Masechet Ta'anit. Everybody ready? I did it pretty quickly to make sure everyone's ready. Okay. Hadran alach Masechet Ta'anit v'hadra chalan. Da'atan alach Masechet Ta'anit v'da'ata chalan. Lo nitnashe minach Masechet Ta'anit v'lo titnashe minan lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Ta'anit v'hadra chalan. Da'atan alach Masechet Ta'anit v'da'ata chalan. Lo nitnashe minach Masechet Ta'anit v'lo titnashe minan lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Ta'anit v'hadra chalan, da'atan alach Masechet Ta'anit v'da'ata chalan, lo nitnashe minach Masechet Ta'anit v'lo titnashe minan, lo ba'al mahaden v'lo ba'al mada'ate. Yehi ratzon l'fanecha, Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu, shetehe toratcha umanutenu ba'olam hazeh, v'tehi imanu la'olam haba. Hanina bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abba bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rachish bar Papa, Surchar bar Papa, Adar bar Papa, Daru bar Papa. Ha'arev na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei toratcha befinu u'fipiyot amcha beit Yisrael v'niyeh anachnu kulanu tze'etze'enu v'tze'etze'ei amcha beit Yisrael kulanu yod'ei shemecha v'lamdei toratcha lishma. Me'ovai techakmeni mitzvotecha ki le'olam hi li. Yehi libi tamim b'chukecha למען לא אבוש, לעולם לא אשכח פיקודיך, כי בם חייתני. ברוך אתה אדוני למדני חוקיך, אמן, 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 סלע ועד. יהי רצון מלפניך אדוני אלוהי, כשם שעזרתני לסיים מסכת תענית, כן תעזרני להתחיל מסכתות וספרים אחרים ולסיימם, ללמוד וללמד, לשמור ולעשות ולקיים את כל דברי תלמוד תורתך באהבה. וזכות כל התנאים והאמוראים ותלמידי חכמים יעמוד לנו ולזרענו שלא תמוש התורה מפינו ומפי זרענו עד עולם. ויתקיים בנו בתהלכך תנחה אותך, בשוכבך תשמור עליך, בהקיצות היא תשיחך. כי בי ירבו ימיך ויוסיפו לך שנות חיים, אורך ימים בימינה, שמאלה עושר וכבוד, אדוני עוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום. מזל טוב, יישר כוח לכולם. Stop my share screen. Okay. So what I want to do right now is, I sometimes forget to do this, but I want to learn together the beginning of the next Masechet. So we'll learn the very beginning of Masechet Megillah, the first line. Megillah nikret b'yud aleph, b'yud bet, b'yud gimel, b'yud aleph, v'tefav. I'm already going to give you a connection here between this and the end of the previous Masechet. In the Yerushalmi, they quote the whole story that we quoted from Rashi about the Meraglim, when they waited there. The ninth, they went into there, they dug their graves. We talked about this in yesterday's stuff. They dug, and then this morning stuff. They dug their graves, they sat there, they waited the 10th, they waited the 11th, they waited the 12th, they waited the 13th, they waited the 14th, they waited the 15th. And on the 15th, they realized, I was thinking it sounds very much like this, right? So the Megillah could be read. Normally, we think the Megillah is read normally on the 14th or the 15th, depending if you live in a walled city or not. If you don't know about this, don't worry, we're going to learn all about it. But in fact, the Megillah sometimes can be read on the 11th or the 12th or the 13th of Adar as well. Lo pachot v'lo yoter. You can't go before 11 and you can't go past 15. And we're going to see the krachim amukafim chomam yimot Yoshua ben Nun korim b'tefvav. The ones that read on Tefvav are the ones that live in the cities, walled cities from the time of Yoshua ben Nun. We'll have to just understand why they chose that, because what does that have to do with the story of Purim? And kfarim v'ayarot gdolot korim b'yud daled. Okay, but if you live in a village or in a big city, then you read in your Dalet, and then we're going to get into, I'll leave that for the next class, which will start on Tuesday when we start Megillah, as to where we get to 11, 12, 13, and those options. Okay, before we start our next section of the Siyum, I just want to make a few announcements while I have your attention. So I want to tell you all that we're starting a few new series. We already started another skills series. We started it in Hebrew through Rani Chana Dreyfus. We do it in collaboration with Yeshivat Drisha. So she's teaching the Hebrew. I'll be teaching the English in the month of February. So that's a skills-based class meant to get your skills. It's a long process, and it could take many years to get your skills up to be learning Gemara independently. But slowly but surely, we want to help you to build up your skills. So it's a skills class. But what we're going to do is, based on some feedback we got from the previous one, is that I like to kind of throw people into the water and sink or swim. But there's some people who prefer a different approach, more of a real beginner's class. So what we're going to do is, before my class, there's going to be a 3-part series with Rabbanit Leah Sarna for like a real beginner's class, not a chavruta. My class will be chavruta. This will be more giving the basics and the fundamentals if you're new to Gemara. So that's a beginner's course. My course is geared for beginners, but also geared for people on a more advanced level, and it will attract people from different levels. So that's something to be looking forward to in the month of January, and in the month of February, it'll be on Sundays. We'll have to skip here and there because we always have Siyums on Sunday, and every month there's a Siyum. So it'll basically be 3 Sundays in January for starting on January 9th, Rabbanit Sarna, and mine will be starting in February. Okay, that's that. The next, and the topic is Tikkun Olam, 4 very interesting sugyot in Masechet Gitin in the 4th chapter about things that are meant for Tikkun Olam, to fix the world, to make things better. So it's a very interesting topic as well. Okay, if you're interested, by the way, and you didn't take the course on Pesachim last year, it sits on our website. It's there. You can register. All our courses are free, and they're all online. So if you didn't you didn't learn them at the time, you can learn them now if you'd like. It's always available. And we're starting our Circle of Friends campaign for 2022. So everyone's welcome to come. We now have, thankfully, tax deductible status in Israel, in America, in Canada, and in Great Britain. So you can now all donate and get tax deductible donations. So I'm welcoming everyone to join our Circle of Friends. You can, if you can't, it's $380 a year, which is basically about $1 a day for every shiur that you come to. So if you enjoy the shiurim, think about giving. If you want, you could give less. If you want, you could give more. All those will help us toward our programming. Okay, I want to now, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Ilana Kurshan, which many of you already know. Many people have already read her book, If All the Seas Were Inked. Everywhere I go, I meet people who told me I started learning Daf Yomi because I read Ilana's book. And Ilana has her book also was honored with the Sammy Rohr Prize. And it's a book that has influenced at least hundreds, if not thousands of people, men and women, to start learning Gemara. And Ilana has a unique ability to, number one, bring the Talmud to life, connect it to make it relevant. And also she's excellent at analyzing Talmudic stories. I love getting into conversations with her about stories that come up in the Gemara. And I'm very excited to introduce her to share with us her analysis of the Rabbi Yochanan and Ilfa story that we learned in our Masechet.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm so excited to have this opportunity to all of you. So a few days ago, I was at the public library with my children, and my daughter happened to pull this book off the shelf. I'm holding it up so you can see it. It's a book I'd never seen before, but she asked me to read it to her, so I opened it. It's called The First Rains, and it's a book about an Indian boy named Arjuna, who's waiting for the start of the monsoon season very, very eagerly. And the newspapers say that it's going to start raining any day now, Zayin Cheshvan, but the rains aren't coming. And as the book goes on, I'm not good at holding this up, but the anticipation grows and grows. And then, of course, on the last page, finally, the rains fall. So I thought this was so apt that she had handed me, of all books to pull off the shelf, just as we're about to finish Masechet Tani. And it happened to also be I think it was the same day Michelle wrote me to ask me to teach, because I sent her a picture. I said, you won't believe it, I'm at the library and look what my daughter just gave me. So Michelle knows this. But anyway, after I was thinking about this, and I said, you know what? You know who would really appreciate this moment? I mean, I'm sure Michelle appreciated it, but Ilfa would really appreciate this moment. Now, why do I say Ilfa? So we all learned this story in Daf Yomi, and I'd like to go back to it tonight with you. It's a story, as y'all recall, that features 2 characters, Ilfa and Rabbi Yochanan. Ilfa is a lesser known figure in the Talmud, doesn't appear all that often. His name comes from the Aramaic word for boat, or perhaps from the Aramaic word for to learn, like yalif. And those two terms really reflect sort of a tension, a polarity in the character of Ilfa. The other figure in our story is Rabbi Yochanan, who is one of the greatest sage in the land of Israel in the 3rd century, rival to Rav and Shmuel in Babylonia at the time. He was the head of a major Beit Midrash in Tiberia. He's quoted on almost every page of the Gemara. And these characters figure in our story, which I would like to, we'll read it together and discuss as we go along. I know you've all seen it before, so read pretty quickly. So I am going to share my screen so you all have the source in front of you, and I have, let's see, all participants. Let's see. Okay, let's see if this works. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Okay, so hopefully you all see it now. Yeah. Okay, good. Okay. Great. Okay. So I'm going to read. Okay. I'm just going to read in the English, but you can follow along in the original. Okay. Ilfa and Rabbi Yochanan studied Torah, and as a result, they became very hard-pressed for money. They said, let us get up and go and engage in commerce, and we will fulfill with regard to ourselves the verse, Efes ki lo yeh v'cha evyon. Okay, so we have a story of two scholars who engage in the study of Torah until they become too poor to do it anymore. They've spent all their lives studying Torah and have not concerned themselves with making a living, but now they have a problem. Their lifestyle has become unsustainable. Basically, they're broke. And so they decide that they're going to leave the Beit Midrash and go get jobs. But you may notice something interesting about the way they speak of their decision to leave the world of Torah learning and go find work, right? How do they justify what they're doing? By quoting a pasuk from Dvarim. That is to say, they invoke words of Torah to justify their decision to leave the world of Torah, almost as if the very Torah that they study is what's requiring them to take a break from that study. Reminds me of a statement by Reish Lakish in Masechet Menachot, Reish Lakish being the study partner of Rabbi Yochanan, who said, Ka'amim shebitula shel Torah zehu yisoda. Sometimes you have to nullify or desist from the study of Torah, and that is the very fulfillment of Torah. Sometimes in order to fulfill the dictates of the Torah, you have to stop learning Torah. As a person who has a hard time stopping to learn Torah, I think about that statement a lot. But I think in order to really understand what they're doing, we have to look at the pasuk they're quoting in its context. Okay, this pasuk, Efes ki lo yeh v'cha evyon. It's a pasuk that appears in the beginning of Devarim, as Moshe teaches the people all the laws they're going to have to observe when they enter Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Canaan. The chapter begins with the laws of the Shemitah year. Every 7th year, all debts will be forgiven. I see, I have the source for you, so I'm just going to scroll down so you can look at the Dvarim source. One second. Okay, here we go. So I'm not going to read it, but I'll summarize, and you can, feel free to read on your own. So basically, we're told that, right, there will be no needy, right, in our verse, there'll be no needy among the people if they fulfill God's laws. Now, these laws may refer to the laws of the Shemitah year, right? If we forgive all debts in the Shemitah year, then we'll ensure that no one is needy. But that doesn't seem to be how Rabbi Yochanan and Ilfa are reading this line. They seem to be reading it out of context as being prescriptive, if not prophetic, right? God has promised that there will be no poor, and so they have to ensure that this promise is fulfilled. There's something a little bit maybe paradoxical about that, because the Torah says that if we heed God's words, right, then God pledges that there will be no poor people. So if so, why not just keep studying Torah and trust that God will provide in keeping with God's promise? So one of these two scholars is going to make that decision, but not quite yet. Okay, we'll come back to Dvarim, but I'm going to go back to our story, the second part. Okay, they went and sat under a dilapidated wall, Gudaria, and were eating bread when two ministering angels arrived. Rabbi Yochanan heard that one angel said to the other, "Let us knock this wall down upon them and kill them, as they abandon the eternal life of Torah study, Chayei Olam, and engage in temporal life, Chayei Sha'ah, for their own sustenance." The other angel said to him, leave them, as there is one of them whose time of achievement stands before him. Literally, like the hour stands for him. Tekaimale shat, probably an astrological term. Okay, so they leave the Beit Midrash, right? They go eat bread. They sit under an unsound wall and they eat bread. And both of these elements are a little bit surprising. Okay, so why sit under an unstable wall? Earlier on the same daf, the Gemara quoted Rabbi Yanai as saying, "Le'olam al ya'amod adam b'makom sakana v'yomar osin lines." Shema ein osin lo nes, right? A person should never put themselves in a place of danger and say, oh, a miracle is going to happen. God's going to save me. How do you know? How can you have that overweening confidence that God is going to save you? You can't know, right? We talked about humility as a major theme in this Masechet, right? There's some hubris in saying like, oh, whatever, I'll be fine if I sit under this unstable wall. Okay, and of course also the bread is a little bit surprising because they're supposed to be completely destitute. Where's the bread coming from? The unstable wall, it's very puzzling. Perhaps we're meant to conclude that for them, only the walls of the Beit Midrash can guarantee stability, whereas everything outside the Beit Midrash is prone to collapse. Perhaps they feel that the moment they leave the Beit Midrash, the world is falling in on them. I would argue furthermore that given that the Talmud was created on the ruins of the destroyed Beit HaMikdash, we can read the entire Talmud as a sort of post-traumatic response to the Churban, such that every collapsing building and structure, and there are several of them in the third parak of Tanit, that's why our story is here, because we're discussing, what are the things we fast for? Well, if there's a collapsing building, a collapsing wall, an avalanche, right? That's one of the things that comes up in the third parak. That every building, every unstable building, every unstable structure is also, in a sense, a ruined Beit HaMikdash. This makes sense, I think, if we consider that one possible intertext for our story, if you believe, as I have come to believe, that so many of the Agadot in the Talmud are set against the backdrop of biblical narratives, which the rabbis rework and imagine. I think sometimes it's almost like, Chazal, they knew all Mikra by heart, and they were always learning Torah, and, sometimes they'd fall asleep, rabbis, like Nim Veloni, and they often fall asleep in the Beit Midrash. It happens fairly often, like is one rabbi sleeping or not sleeping? Is he just testing a student? Anyway, I imagine sometimes it's like the rabbis fall asleep with a particular story that they're learning and they've collapsed on the book. And then they have these wild dreams, in which they're sort of developing the whatever biblical story they're learning. And that's how we get the Agadah. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that perhaps one intertext for our story is the beginning of Parshat Vayetze, when Yaakov leaves the security of his father's house in Beersheba, where his situation has become untenable thanks to his brother Esav, and he sets out for all the unknowns of Haran. Why do I say this is an intertext? Well, according to the Midrash in Breshit Rabbah, Yaakov is in fact leaving the Beit Midrash of Shem and Aver, where he's just spent 14 years learning. The Midrash teaches that when the Torah says, Vayikatz Yaakov Mishnato, that Yaakov awoke from his sleep, we may also read it as Vayikatz Yaakov Mi Mishnato, that Yaakov was roused from the world of Mishnah, from the world of learning that he had been immersed in for so long. Yaakov, like Ilfa and like Rabbi Yochanan, leaves the secure world of the Beit Midrash behind and encounters angelic presences en route to his new life. Moreover, Yaakov takes a vow when he wakes up from his dream, Im yeh Elokim imadi, right? If God, you will give me bread to eat and clothes to wear, vows Yaakov, which is presumably Ilfa and Rabbi Yochanan's concern as well, as they sit there eating what little bread they have. How will they provide for themselves given how destitute they are? What is this unknown world that awaits them outside the Beit Midrash as they wake up mimishnatam? Now the story begins to take a bit of a supernatural turn with the introduction of the two ministering angels. Why do these angels arrive? Are they meant to accompany each of these men on their journey, like the angels ascending and descending the ladder when Yaakov sets out for Haran? The first angel suggests killing the sages as punishment for leaving the Beit Midrash, but the other angel rises to their defense on account of the fact that one of the sage is destined for greatness. And I'll go back to our story and I'll read section 3. Okay, so this conversation among the angels, Rabbi Yochanan heard all this, but Ilfa did not hear the angels' conversation. Rabbi Yochanan said to Ilfa, did the master hear anything, right? Ilfa said to him, no. Rabbi Yochanan said to himself, since I heard the angels and Ilfa did not hear, I can learn from this that it is I whose time of achievement stands before me. In other words, the angels were talking about me. Rabbi Yochanan said to Ilfa, I will return home and fulfill with regard to myself the contrary verse, ki lo yechdal evyon mikerev haaretz. Here we have a masterful use of dramatic irony. We have been privy to the angels' conversation, but one of the sages has not. Rabbi Yochanan overhears this conversation among the angels, and presumably he thinks to himself, wait, is it me? Am I the one destined for greatness? Right? And the best way to check is to check in with Ilfa. Ilfa hasn't heard, so Rabbi Yochanan concludes it must be he. Perhaps Rabbi Yochanan's continued attunement to the eternal realm is evidence that he remains ambivalent about having left this life, whereas Ilfa has moved on. Rabbi Yochanan explains his decision to Ilfa, justifying it by invoking a biblical verse that appears just 7 psukim later in that same parak in Dvarim, ki lo yechdal evyon mikerev haaretz. Now I want to go back to Dvarim for a minute because when right, we've now quoted 2 psukim from Dvarim and we very conveniently skipped over 7 psukim in between. And if you look at the 7 psukim that we've skipped over, I'll just read a little bit to you, right? I'm not crazy. Okay. If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites, it sounds better in Hebrew because it's like from one of your brothers, right? From a person you're very close to, right? In any of the towns of the land the Lord your God is giving to you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. And don't think, I'm going to paraphrase, don't think because the Shemitah year is coming and debts will be forgiven, this is not a good time to make a loan, right? Apropos of the class about Tikkun Olam, anyone's nice intertext. But anyway, right? Don't think, oh, this is a bad time to make a loan. You have to give generously, right? Don't begrudge your fellow, your brother. There will always be poor in the land, and you're obligated to help out the poor. And I really view these psukim. I didn't think of this before, learning now this whole Masechet, and seeing how much the theme of solidarity and really supporting those around you who are in distress, although you may not be in distress, is a big theme of this Masechet. We saw it a lot in this parak, in the 3rd parak, right? Right? If one city has pestilence or whatever, and has something bad happen to it, but one town does, but your town is nearby and you're not affected by this. Well, do you have to also fast? Do you have to also blow the shofar, right? Right? We saw that come up a few times in the Mishnah, right? Like, to what extent do you have to show solidarity for those who are suffering? What Rabbi Yochanan is doing, right? In conveniently skipping over these 7 verses, which speak of the importance of not forsaking one's brother, giving him whatever he is lacking, Rabbi Yochanan is kind of making a selfish decision here. He's saying, okay, if one of us is destined for greatness, it's clearly me. And where is greatness to be found if not in the world of Torah learning? And so he decides he's going to head back to the Beit Midrash. Now, I want to note here that the different life choices that each of these sages make is not without precedent. Over 100 years earlier, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai engaged in a similar debate about this very question of how to balance work and Torah. Their debate appears in the 6th chapter of Masechet Brachot, in which both sages are struggling with a pasuk from Dvarim, different pasuk from Dvarim, from the 2nd paragraph of the Shema, where we're told that if we obey God's commandments, v'haya'im shamoa, then God will cause the rain to fall. Apropos of our Masechet, the land will yield its bounty. The people will gather in new grain every year. Let me just show you here. I have the sugya here. Okay, it's Bavli Brachot. It's in Brachot Lamed Hamud Bet. Okay, you have it on your source sheet now, source 3. It should be in front of you. Okay, so I'm just going to summarize, but again, you have it in front of you, but in the interest of time, I think I'll just paraphrase. Okay. So if people will obey God's words, then God will cause the rain to fall and the people will gather in new grain every year. But how can the people be bothered to gather in new grain every year, right? After all, as we learn in Sefer Yehoshua, right? Here. Okay. So basically, right? You're supposed to gather in new grain, and Rabbi Yishmael says, yes, you are supposed to gather in new grain. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to learn Torah. I'll just read in section 1. Should this be taken here? Our sages taught you shall gather in new grain. What does this teach? What does this teach? Because it says, Lo yamush sefer haTorah hazem mipicha. Okay, you're supposed to always have Torah in your lips. V'gita bo yomam v'layla. You're supposed to be learning Torah all the time. Should this be taken literally? It teaches v'asafta diganecha. You're supposed to gather in the grain. How can you be at once gathering in your grain, performing agricultural labor and studying Torah all the time? Rabbi Yishmael says, perform worldly occupations together with them. That is to say, combine Torah and your work, make them, do both. Section 2, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, is it possible that a man plow in the plowing season, sow in the sowing season, harvest in the harvest season, thresh in the threshing season, winnow when the wind blows? Right? Agricultural work is a full-time job. You don't get a break, right? You're always out there in the fields. Then what will become of Torah? Torah mateheh aleha. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, I don't get it, right? We're supposed to study Torah all the time. How is that possibly compatible with gathering in grain, with all the agricultural labor we're supposed to do? What is the solution? When Israel fulfills the will of God, their work is done by others. As it is said, strangers shall stand and pasture your flocks. When they do not fulfill the word of God, then their work is done by themselves. As it is said, you shall gather in new grain. Okay, so basically, right, this we have these two opposite opinions, right? In a way, right, you have Rabbi Yishmael's opinion, which is like Ilfa's view of like, okay, I'm going to find a way to I have to go make a living, right? I have to do my agricultural work or whatever it is the work I need to do, as opposed to Rashbi, who says, no, right? I'm going to do God's will and God will provide, right? Strangers will stand in and pasture my flocks. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan, right, follows the opinion of Rashbi, who says, right, Torah mateheh aleha, whereas Rabbi Yishmael is concerned about what will happen to the individual who may potentially go broke. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is concerned about what will become of Torah. He doesn't worry that the Torah scholar will go broke because he's confident that God will provide. The Sugya in Brachot ends with a cautionary tale from Abaye. I'll just read this. Abaye said, many acted in accordance with Rabbi Yishmael and prospered. In accordance with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, many also acted and they did not prosper. That is to say, those who followed Rabbi Yishmael's advice generally met with success, whereas those who followed Rashbi's advice did not. This makes sense, especially when we consider that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rashbi, right, he's the rabbi who famously hid in a cave with his son for 12 years studying Torah, entirely unconcerned about worldly pursuits. He uses the same terms, chai olam and chai isha, to justify his decision to stay in the cave and then to explain what happens when he leaves the cave. He stays there until he hears the voice of Elijah summoning him out. He doesn't have to worry about making a living because God provides for him a carob tree, a spring of water that miraculously supply all his nutritional needs. Bar Yochai had the experience of studying Torah to the exclusion of all else, and he's convinced that this is the way to go. But as Abaye warns, not everyone is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Not everyone merits to hear these heavenly voices. Ilfa, as we know, did not. Indeed, at least one source suggests that Rabbi Yochanan had an element of Rashbi's very radical devotion to studying Torah to the exclusion of all worldly pursuits. And I'll read you it's source 5, it's from Shir Shrim Rabbah. I think you can't really appreciate this source in English. So what I'm going to do is I think I'll just read it and follow along if you wish in the English so that you can hear it, okay? But you can read it in English, I'll read it in Hebrew, okay? Rabbi Yochanan, hava mitayel, v'salek mitveria letzipori, v'hava Rabbi Chia bar Abba samechle. Miton chad beit chakla, amar Rabbi Yochanan, hadin beit chakla havat didi, v'zabin te begin mile d'oraita. Miton chad beit kerem, ve'amar Rabbi Yochanan, hadin beit kerem didi hava, v'zabin te begin mile d'oraita. Miton chad beit zeta, ve'amar kmochen. Shari Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Bachay. Amar le, Ma'at Bachay. Amar le, Bachay Ana, Delat Shvakt, Lesibuchech, Klum. אמר לו, חיה, בני, ונקלה זו בעיניך מה שעשיתי, שמכרתי דבר שניתן ל6 ימים, שנאמר, כי 6 ימים עשה השם את השמיים ואת הארץ, אבל התורה ניתנה ל40 יום, שנאמר, וישם עם השם 40 יום, right, describing Moshe and Sinai, לחם לא אכל, right, ומים לא שתה, okay, וכתיב וישב בהר 40 יום, קדמך רבי יוחנן, היה דורו קורא עליו, and here's the connection to Shir Hashirim, אם ייתן איש את כל הון ביתו באהבה, שאהב רבי יוחנן את התורה, בוז יבוזו לו. Okay, so the idea is, right, Rabbi Yochanan, right, everything, all physical things, all property, all material things, right, he was willing to just give up for the sake of studying Torah. And the competition between Torah and any worldly pursuit, Torah always won out for Rabbi Yochanan. Why? Well, everything in the world was created in 6 days, but the giving of Torah, well, that was 40 days. Clearly, Torah is more significant and more momentous than, right? I think we saw that even in Tanit or Gadol Yom HaGshamim, Ki Yom Shenitna Bo Torah, right? We know that Torah is, right, of course, paramount for Chazal. And here we see it for Rabbi Yochanan to the extreme. Okay, so let's go back to our story. Okay, that was a little bit of an aside, but we're gonna get to the end of our story. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan goes back to the Beit Midrash, right, justifying himself using this pasuk from Dream. Okay, section 4. Where am I? Okay. Rabbi Yochanan returned to the Beit Midrash, and Ilfa did not return, but went to engage in business instead. By the time that Ilfa came back from his travels, Rabbi Yochanan had been appointed head of the Beit Midrash, and his financial situation had improved. His student said to Ilfa, if master had sat and studied instead of going off on his business ventures, wouldn't the master have been appointed the head of the academy? Okay, and we don't know how Ilfa feels about being abandoned by Rabbi Yochanan, but it's hard to imagine that he wasn't distressed when he returned to this kind of welcome. Sure enough, Rabbi Yochanan has been appointed the head of the academy, suggesting that he was right in the conclusions that he drew. In any case, when Ilfa later realizes what happens, he becomes distressed, if not angry. After all, while the decision to leave the Beit Midrash was a joint one, it was only Ilfa who completely disconnected to such an extent that he could no longer overhear the heavenly conversation. Rabbi Yochanan remained with one foot or one ear still in the door, and he returned shortly thereafter. Perhaps Ilfa feels betrayed by his colleague's lack of solidarity, his colleague who forsook the temporal life they had both committed themselves to pursuing. And we find that he gets driven to desperate measures, and I will read. Ilfa went and suspended himself from the mast of a ship, saying, if there is anyone who can ask me a question concerning a baraita of Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yoshaya, and I cannot resolve his problem from a Mishnah, then I will fall from the mast of this ship and be drowned, okay? Ilfa seems desperate to prove that in spite of having engaged in commerce all those years, he still remains learned in Torah. He may not be the one who studied in the Beit Midrash all those years and became the head of the academy, but he's no ignoramus. Perhaps he's also reacting to a statement by Rabbi Yochanan, a statement Rabbi Yochanan made elsewhere in the Talmud in Eruvin, in which Rabbi Yochanan insists that those who engage in commerce cannot possibly be learned in Torah. I'll just read that. Here, source 4. Rabbi Yochanan said, Lo bashamayim hi, what does that mean? Lo timsa b'gasei ruach. You're not going to find Torah in those who are haughty. V'lo me'ever layam hi, and Torah is not across the sea. Lo timatzei lo b'sachranim v'lo b'tagarim. Right, you're not going to find Torah among business people, traveling businessmen, or peddlers. Those are not people who could ever be learning in Torah. Meaning, Torah is not in the heavens, meaning you can't raise yourself up to the high heavens and think you'll know a lot of Torah. Torah requires humility, and Torah is not to be found who make their living traveling the seas. Ilfa is in a way guilty on both counts. He raises himself up to the mast of the ship, right? An image that recalls that the mast of the ship connecting heaven and earth, recalling the Sulam Yaakov also. And he boasts about how much Torah he knows. And he insists that in spite of devoting much of his adult life to sailing the seas, engaged in commercial pursuits, he is nonetheless well-versed in Torah. Read in the context of the source from Eruvain, Ilfa's challenge seems to be an attempt to pointedly refute Rabbi Yochanan's claims about who does and does not have the capacity to study and retain Torah. No, we're not going to look at that. I think we'll here. I'm not going to read the specifics of the challenge that is posed to Ilfa as he stands there on the ship and says, can anyone name a Breita, and I'll be able to show you the Mishnah that says the same thing. I want to think with you for a moment about, I'll just say in brief, right? The nature of the challenge that's posed to him, right? It's the old man comes in and poses a challenge to him, and it's about the case of a father who deposits money with a third party for the support of his children, and he gives that third party instructions as to how to distribute the money. So the legal discussion is about providing for those in need, continuing the theme of poverty with which the story began and the verses from Dvarim, which we saw. Ilfa, true to his word, is able to associate this Breita with a Mishnaic statement attributed to Rabbi Meir. By Mishnah, he refers to what we think of as Mishnah, the collection of rabbinic teachings compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi in the early 3rd century. Those teachings that did not make it into the Mishnah were known as Breitot, from the Aramaic word bar, meaning outside. Breitot are rabbinic statements that were left on the cutting room floor after the Mishnah was compiled. Various rabbis had their own collections of Breitot, most famously Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yoshaya, who are cited here. And so essentially what Ilfa is saying is that for any teaching that seems to be only preserved in a Breita, he will be able to find a corresponding Mishnah. In other words, anything that you think is outside, says Ilfa, I will prove it's inside. What more fitting activity could we imagine for a scholar who's just spent the past several years of his life outside the Beit Midrash, but who wishes to prove that he still remains bound to everything that took place inside its walls? What I'm trying to say here is I think that Ilfa is also making a comment about himself. I, who you think of as outside, since I've been outside the Beit Midrash for the past few decades, I am actually still inside it. I am both Ilfa the ship and Ilfa the learner, encompassing both meanings of the Aramaic term. I have been outside the Beit Midrash, but I've never truly left it. And to prove it to you, I'm going to demonstrate my ability to link any Breita, anything outside, with something inside. I find Ilfa's challenge deeply moving to me personally as someone who's always trying to link what I am learning with what is happening to me in my life outside the Beit Midrash. Just a few days ago, I had an experience very similar where my children, we made s'mores for dinner and they were really delicious. And of course we happened to have some leftover marshmallows and chocolate and you know, those biscuits in the pantry. And the next day my daughter came home from school and she opened the pantry and said, looked at all these supplies and said, wow, Ima, those s'mores were so delicious. And I thought to myself, yep, that's the difference between Mazkirin and Shoalim. She knows that if she says, can we have more s'mores? I'll say, what do you mean? You know, we didn't have dinner yet, s'mores. But she's like, oh, Mazkirin, you know, it's not the right oh now, but anyway. So that is to say, I feel like I'm constantly making these connections between the outside and the inside. And in keeping with that spirit, I want to conclude with a source from the end of Masechet Kiddushin, in which I will put on the screen, our last source, in which Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar laments that he has to make a living. You know, why does he have to work? Why should he have to work? It's not fair, he says. The animals don't work. None of the animals have to support themselves. Why should he? And he realizes, oh, well, okay, I know why. It's because of, you know, Chet of Adam Rishon, who, you know, sinned in Gan Eden, and therefore, B'zayat Apecha Tochal Lechem, right? This is the curse of Genesis. Anyway, I'll just read it quickly. I'll read it in English, okay? Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, okay, this is his lament. I never saw a deer work as one who dries figs, nor did I ever see a lion work as a porter, nor a fox work as a storekeeper. And yet they earn their livelihood without anguish, right? These animals have what to eat without working. But all these were created, all these animals were created only to serve me. And I was created to serve the one who formed me. If these who were created only to serve me earn their livelihood without anguish, then is it not right that I, who was created to serve the one who formed me, should earn my livelihood without anguish? Aye, but I have committed evil actions and I have lost my livelihood, as it is stated. Your iniquities have turned away these things and your sins have held back from you. From Yirmiyahu. It is taught, Rabbi Nehorai said, I would set aside all the trades in the world and teach my son only Torah. Never mind. As all other trades serve one only in the days of his youth. But in the days of his old age, behold, he's left to lie in hunger, right? Most people have to retire at some point, right? And you can't do your job anymore. But Torah is not like this. It serves a person in the time of his youth and provides with him with a future and hope in the time of his old age. With regard to the time of his youth, what does it say? Kovei Hashem yachlifu choach. With regard to the time of his old age, what does it say? They shall bring forth fruit in old age and shall be full of sap and richness. This story gives voice to one ideal in our tradition, but I think that the story of Ilfa is a reminder that there's a tremendous amount of learning that can happen when we're engaged in other pursuits. To show that, I wrote a sonnet about this sugya. I have a love of poetry that comes from the world of outside the Beit Midrash, but I love to bring it into the world of Beit Midrash, so I'll just read it. Shimon, it's a Shakespearean sonnet. Shimon ben Elazar said, no such thing is there as deer that take out figs to dry. No heavy burden bears the lion king. No cunning fox sells goods for man to buy. Nay, only man doth plow and till and hoe, and work from dawn to dusk just to afford his food. Though beasts serve man, they do not know of toil. Why must man who serves the Lord? For labor is man's punishment for sin. Nehorai thought, well, that's a rotten lot. I'd give up every job I traded in and train my son in Torah. Heck, why not? A job may serve a young man when he's spry, but Torah gives old men the wings to fly. Okay, Yachlifu Iver Kanasharim. From Ilfa, we can learn that there are many ways to live a life of Torah learning. Ilfa's challenge on the ship speaks to those of us who do not spend all of our days immersed in the Beit Midrash, which I think is true of most of us Daf Yomi learners. We're Ilfas, not Rabbi Yochanan's. We're not spending all our days in the Beit Midrash. Rather, the challenge we have set for ourselves is how to carve out time each day to learn some Torah amidst everything else we have going on in our personal and professional lives. Ilfa's challenge from the ship is in the same spirit as a lunchtime Torah class at a major law firm downtown, or a 6 a.m. Daf Yomi shir on a commuter train. Ilfa found ways to integrate Torah into his life, and all those non-professional Jews among us would do well to learn from his example. What makes the study of Torah so meaningful for me is the search for those connections between Torah and the rest of my learning, thinking, and living. How do the rabbinic sources I study in the Beit Midrash speak to the Shakespearean sonnets I love to read? How does the novel I'm in the middle of reading speak to the sugya I'm learning, or the book that my daughter pulls off the shelf in the library? How does the Parsha inform a challenge I'm facing in my family life? This is the challenge that Ilfa sets for himself. He stands at the top of a ship, far adrift from the world of the Beit Midrash, and he's able to demonstrate that the sea he is sailing in is nonetheless Yam HaHalacha, the sea of Halacha and the sea of Torah. May we all merit to follow his example. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilana. Very beautiful. Okay, I would like to now introduce Catriella Freedman. Ilana, just undo your share screen if you can. Catriella Freedman had the privilege of both studying in women's Batei Midrash and also has a degree in Jewish studies from Harvard. And she's the author of Foundations of Jewish Family Living, a Melton Curriculum, part of the Matan faculty, and also a director of PJR Way. And we're excited to have her analyze another story, as Masechet was full of stories, that it was too good an opportunity not to take advantage to learn these stories a little bit more in depth. So, Catriella.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and Mazal Tov to everyone tonight. What a special, special evening. And I couldn't help myself. I had to say something about Honi. And I think in many ways, Honi really is a metaphor for everything that we've been looking at in Tani and the transition from the world of prophecy, the first Beit HaMikdash, the second Beit HaMikdash, the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, and contending with the end of prophecy, and contending with the lack of easy answers and having to depend on our efforts. And Michelle, you so beautifully connected to this at the end of Masechet Tani, talking about the Machol Tzadikim, the circle of Tzadikim, and the fact that Honi is by himself in that circle. He doesn't bring other people into that circle, and perhaps that's part of the issue that Shimon ben Shetak has with him. So before I share my screen, I also just want to give credit to Dr. Moshe Simon Shoshan, who helped me a lot with some various articles that he's written about Honi ha-Magel, and Michelle, you've referred to them in the class as well. And so that's, I just put on the chat a source to his website. Maggie, am I able to share my screen? Okay, it looks like I am able to share my screen.
Yes, you can share.
Okay, does everybody see my sources here? No, hold on one second. Just move this to the right place. And this is the one I want to share. Okay, great. Okay, so let's take a look at where we really first encounter Honi in Mishnah, Tanit, and Perek Gimel that we learned together. And Honi comes up in many different variations, both in the Bavli and in the Yerushalmi. And we're going to just try to quick look at how his personality changes, how our perspectives on his personality change. So quickly looking at the Mishnah, anytime there was any kind of issue in the community, we are told matri'in alehen. We should yell out, call out, blow a shofar, fast, anything except for too much rain. And then even though too much rain can be severely damaging, we are told, no, that you don't call out for. And how do we learn about that? We learned that from the story of Honi ha-Magel, who was asked to pray for rain. And he comes into the whole situation with a lot of bravado and says, he says, go and bring in your Pesach ovens. So we get the sense from this Mishnah, although it doesn't say it very explicitly, we get the sense that rain has already not come for most of the season. We're already right up to Pesach. There's no rain, but he has so much bravado. He says, bring in the ovens. The ovens are clay ovens outside. They're going to get ruined in the rain. Okay. So we all have a little bit of schadenfreude, even though it's our own existence. Haha, the rain didn't come, even though you had so much bravado. And at this point, he goes to extremes, and he makes a circle on the ground, stands in the circle, and says, Ribbono shel olam, banecha samu pnehem alai, shani keben bayit lefanecha. Your children have turned to me, because I'm a ben bayit in your house. And I promise you, I'm not moving out of this circle until you have rachamim on your children and you bring the rain. So then we have the whole story. The rain comes a little bit, and it's sort of like Goldilocks and the three bears in Masechet Tani. It's not enough, it's too much, you have to stop. Okay. I wanted to just highlight the fact that he calls the Jews your children, and he calls himself a ben bayit. At the end of the story, Shlach lo Shimon ben Shetak gets involved, and he says, if you were not Honi, I would make sure that you were excommunicated. And what does that mean? If you were not Honi, I would excommunicate you. There's so many questions about this. What Shimon ben Shetak says here is that the reason I can't excommunicate you is because you're like a child to God. You're like God's son. And basically, you can do anything that you want. You're spoiled rotten. What if you want something, God listens. And the pasuk that Shimon ben Shetach uses to underscore this is Yismach avicha ve'imecha v'tagel yoledetecha. Let your father and your mother be glad, and let her who bore you rejoice. Meaning, it doesn't matter what your kids do. You love your kids no matter what. God loves you no matter what. And I can't put you into excommunication, even though I should. Now, Shimon ben Shetach doesn't say, why? Why does Honi ha-Magel have to go into excommunication? There was a desperate situation. People called him in. He did what he was supposed to do. He may have come in with a lot of bravado. He made this circle. Maybe that was too much. But he did what he was supposed to do. And he never called himself a child of God's child. He said, I'm a ben bait. What's a ben bait? A ben bait is a member of the household. He's a member of the household. It's like someone who runs your fields for you, or someone who makes sure that all the logistics in your house and your business are taken care of. And he said, they're the children. I'm here to help you take care of your children. So he sort of sees himself as an agent between God and Jewish people. So there's a little bit of a disparity between what Shimon ben Shetach describes him as and how Honi sees himself. So now we go to the Breita later on. As the Gemara is trying to understand the Honi story, it brings up another kind of expansion of the story. And here we have maybe two more clues as to what is going on. So first of all, Honi says, you know what? I'm going to make a circle. Ag ugav amad b'topo, and this is from Tani Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph. Kederach she'asa Habakuk Hanavi, just like Habakuk Hanavi did this. And what did Habakuk Hanavi do? He also made an ultimatum. He said, I'm going to put myself in a self-imposed prison, and I'm not coming out until God, you answer me. And so Honi compares himself to Habakuk, which is a little bit of an unorthodox thing to do because Honi's a miracle maker. He's not a prophet. And yet he really identifies with a prophet. That could be a problem. So, and now we see an expansion on what Shimon ben Shetach says too. He says, Il melech Honi atagozrani alechem naduri, like in the Mishnah, if you weren't Honi, I would throw you into excommunication, I would throw you into perem. She'ilu shanim kishnei Eliyahu shemaftechot shamim biyado shel Eliyahu lo nimtza shem shamayim mitchalel al yadecha. I'm not going to go into the details of what this means. It's a very interesting explanation, but basically, who do you think you are? You think you're Eliyahu Hanavi, and of course, Eliyahu Hanavi was the famous prophet who used the mafteach of rain. He used the key of rain to prove God over the priests of the Ovdei Kochavim, and then later took away the rain because he saw Bnei Yisrael sinning in the time of Achav. So here's this fiery figure of Eliyahu Hanavi, and Shimon ben Shetach is making the natural connection that we already have made in our mind, that these two people are rainmakers. But you may be a rainmaker, Honi, but you're no Eliyahu Hanavi. You're no prophet. And so just as Honi makes a comparison between himself and Habakkuk, Shimon ben Shetach takes him down a rung and says, you're no Navi. You're just a miracle maker. And I wish I could put you in Purim because we don't have room for miracle makers like yourself here, even though we're so desperate. So we already had seen some issues as to why Shimon ben Shetach is so upset at Honi ha-Magel back in Brachot, when we have this line, Hamagista Toka Pemala, someone who shows arrogance to God, someone who is arrogant vis-a-vis heaven, and who's the example? Honi ha-Magel. Back in Brachot, we already saw this. So we're getting a sense that Shimon ben Shetach seems very uncomfortable with the idea of what Honi is doing. And we know that in the Second Temple period, and we know that in Second Temple literature, we have a lot of references to these miracle makers. And in Tani, we have more that we learn about Honi ha-Magel, and we learn about Honi ha-Magel's descendants. And all of them have these special capabilities. And we also hear about Hasidim, like this idea of Hasidim, they kind of work outside of the parameters of the Beit HaMikdash, and also work outside of the parameters of the Beit Midrash. And so there's this tension that we see building up throughout our descriptions of Honi ha-Magel. And there's definitely a threat seen from Honi. And this, I think, is really highlighted very well in Breshit Rabbah, where we see an explanation of a pasuk. Va'adam, and here we are in this right over here. Va'adam ein la'avod et ha'adama. Man won't be able to till the earth. Va'adam ein la'avid et ha'briut la'kadosh baruch hu ke'eliyahu u'kehoni ha-Magel. No one is able, lavid, it's a play of the word of la'avod, making it into a hifil. No one is able to bring people to worship God like Eliyahu and Honi. And what is the power of Eliyahu and Honi? What does it mean that they have this power? Well, we know that throughout, various stages from the transition from the first Beit HaMikdash to the second Beit HaMikdash, we have the prophets, Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu, and then we have later we have Ezra, and then we have the rabbis in the Beit HaMidrash trying to compel people, like Michelle brought up, trying to compel people to action, to tefillah, to fasting, to taking it upon yourself to change our reality. And yet, Honi, who are the most successful at doing it? Honi and Eliyahu. And why are Honi and Eliyahu so successful? Because at the end of the day, people really love to have a spectacle. They love to see that someone is able to actually do something miraculous before their eyes. And that's an amazing thing. If you have a miracle maker, if you have a rainmaker, someone who's able to make it so clear that they can change a reality, change a desperate situation. It's already Adar, it's already almost Nisan, and we don't have rain, and they're able to bring rain. That's a spectacle. That's an amazing thing. So what's the problem with that? Well, we know what the problem is essentially, but we can highlight it at the very beginning of Masechet Tani. Rabbi Yochanan says, "Shloshat maftechot bi'adosh hakadosh baruch hu shelo nimtzu bi'ad shaliach." There were three keys that only God holds onto, and He won't even send it through an intermediary. What are those three keys? Maftech shel shamim, the key of rain. Maftech shel chaya, the key of fertility. Maftech shel tchiyat hametim, the key of the resurrection of the dead. Now, I'm not going to touch the third one. It's confusing to me, but the first two are really, really so connected, because we've talked about throughout Masechet Tani, rain, and the Torah makes this explicit in Shema. Rain is our connection to knowing what our relationship is with God. It's our connection to God. It's our connection to parnasah. It's our connection to food. It's our connection to sustenance. And whether or not we have rain has always been seen as a reflection of what our status is with God. So too fertility. The times in the Torah, the times in Tanakh, where we see the height of beseeching is the akaraz, the woman who's infertile, who turns to God, who turns in prayer for requests. And the example the Gemara gives to Maftech Shel Chaya is Rivka and Yitzhak, two people who had a huge amount of status, who probably could have been miracle makers in their own right, who had an element of prophecy in their personalities, and yet at the end of the day, how do they beseech God? Yitzchak says, "I can't help you," to Rivka. And how does Rivka beseech God? Through words. What's that? How does Rivka beseech God? It's through words. It's through her ability to. It's through her ability to actually go deep into her heart and tell God what she needs. That is the opposite of Honi ha-Magel. Honi ha-Magel does not bring people into his circle. Eliyahu does not bring people into his circle. They take actions without bringing people into the environment that's being into the hold on, just clear all drawings. There we go. Okay, but Honi doesn't invite people into that conversation. And so we start to get a sense of what Shimon ben Shetach is, what his issues are with Honi. And so I quickly want to just look at the three types of Honi that we see and how they are just so different from each other. So the Talmud Yerushalmi, in its own Gemara on the Mishnah that we just looked at, has a very different kind of story than what we are used to from the Bavli. So the Bavli story we'll look at shortly, but we don't have to go into great detail. We know that in the Bavli story, in connection to who this Honi is, it tells the whole story about how Honi sees a guy planting carob trees and says, why are you doing it? And he says, I'm doing it because, are you going to be alive? You're never going to be able to see those carob trees. And he says, I'm doing it because my father did it, and these trees were here before me, and so I'm planting it for the future. And this idea of investing into the future is a very powerful one. But we have a totally different story in the Yerushalmi. In the Yerushalmi, the story is that Honi falls asleep. While he was there, he lived towards the end of the first Beit HaMikdash. He went to a mountain to his workers. So this actually is the story of Honi's grandfather, according to the Gemara, according to the Yerushalmi. But his name is also Honi ha-Magel. It's basically the same story, but very different. He went to a mountain to his workers. While he was there, rain fell. He went to a cave. So even though he wasn't asking for rain, somehow the communication with God is always there. When he was sitting down, he slumbered and fell asleep. He stayed in his sleep for 70 years while the temple was destroyed and rebuilt. At the end of the 70 years, he awoke from sleep. He left the cave and found the world changed. At a place where there had been vineyards were olive trees. At a place where there had been olive trees were a field. He asked about the province and said to them, what is news in the world? They answered him, do you not know what is news in the world? He said, no. They asked him, who are you? He answered them, Honius, that's another story, Honi the circle drawer. They told him, we heard that when he entered the temple courtyard, it lit up. He went there, Honi went into the Mikdash, Beit HaMikdash, and it lit up. He recited about himself, B'shuv Hashem et Shivat Siyum, hayinu kechomim. When God brought us back to Siyum, we were like dreamers. And so let's just do a very quick comparison between the story here in the Yerushalmi and the story that is so famous in the Bavli. So first of all, what's clear in the Yerushalmi? Everybody knows who Honi is. So he wakes up and things are different. But basically, Honi, from the end of the first Beit HaMikdash in this story, is basically the same as Honi at the beginning of the second Beit HaMikdash in this story. Whereas in our story in the Bavli, everything has changed and nothing remains the same. So while things around both Honis have changed, in this version, he's able to light up the Beit HaMikdash again. He is miraculous still. He represents a bridge between the first and the second Beit HaMikdash. In a way, this story is trying to say there is no change. Do not think about the second Beit HaMikdash any differently than you thought of the first Beit HaMikdash. Even if Honi, even the miracle maker, even the rain maker is still the same. He is still able to bring light, and the metaphor of light is a beautiful one in connection with rain. He is still that same person. And this Honi takes that verse, God returned us, God led us back to Zion, and we were like sleepers. It's literal for this Honi. He fell asleep for the 70 years and stumbled as a half asleep person into the new Beit HaMikdash. It's as though the Beit HaMikdash never left. And so that's a different Honi, very much empowered still with that sense of prophecy and with that sense of miracle making. Of course, in our version in the Bavli, before we get to our version in the Bavli, we don't have to go too much into it, but things are not the same. And there's a great depression that comes over Honi in realizing that he no longer is useful to his community the way his great-great-grandfather was back between the first Beit HaMikdash and the second Beit HaMikdash, and the way his own personality was in the second Beit HaMikdash. Honi, the idea of Honi, the idea of the prophet, the idea of the miracle maker does not have the same relevance. And it's probably because of what Shimon ben Shetach is talking about. It's not just that Honi approached God with arrogance, or Honi presented himself as a Ben Bait, or a Ben, actually. but that we are now coming into a world without a mikdash, with only our ability to relate to each other as a community, to be like Rivka and to have our heartfelt communication to God be through prayer and be through ma'asim, be through actions. And I think the best way of looking at this actually is in Josephus, because Josephus also knew about Honi. And Josephus, in his first century work on it called the Antiquities of the Jews, talks about the battle between Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, the two Hasmonean sons who basically fought each other and had a civil war as to who was going to be the next king. And eventually their civil war, the civil war amongst the Jews, led to eventual Roman interference in Eretz Israel, and eventually led to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. So here we have Honi. If you look at the highlighted part, there was one who was named Onias, a righteous man he was and beloved of God, who in a certain drought had prayed to God to put an end to the intense heat, and whose prayers God had heard and had sent them rain. Okay, so Josephus knows about this story also. This man had hid himself because he saw that this sedition would last a great while. The civil war is going to go on for a while. I might as well just go to sleep, right? It's like our Yerushalmi story and it's like our Bavli story. However, they brought him to the Jewish camp and desired that as by his prayers he had once put an end to the drought, so he would in a like manner make imprecations on Aristobulus and those of his faction. And when upon his refusal and the excuses that he made, he was still by the multitude compelled to speak, he stood up in the midst of them and said, "O God, the King of the whole world, since those that stand now with me are thy people, and those that are besieged are also thy priests, I beseech you that you will not listen to the prayers of those, and you will not listen to the prayers of those." He basically says, I'm not getting involved. This is Jew against Jew. God should not get involved with this. I'm not praying for God to get involved with this. Whereupon such wicked Jews as stood about him, as soon as he made his prayer, they stoned him to death. And so, while in our Bavli story, Honi prays for his own death, in the Josephus rendition, we see that no one has any need for Honi once he can't do miracles for them. So once he can't do something, once they cannot take advantage of his skills, they can't take advantage of his Ben Bait status, they can't take advantage of this prophetic skill he has, he's no use to them any longer. And I think in a way, Shimon ben Shetach is relating to that. And he's saying, we don't want a world where it's the Honis and the Eliahus that bring Jews together, that make us into a community, that inspire us to pray and to ma'asim. We don't want leaders who are going to put on a spectacle. We want leaders who are going to bring us all into that circle so that we can all take action, not feel like we can depend on him to take action or on her to take action, that we are all going to be taking action together. And so if he's just going to be known as a miracle maker, eventually his skills are going to be unneeded and end up in the way Josephus described. And of course, I think everyone in the Shir probably is relating to the story of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and the great argument he had about the Tanur of Achnai with the other rabbis and the Beit Midrash, where Eliezer ben Hyrcanus does everything when he sees that he cannot win the argument logically. And Baba Metzia, what does Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus do? He starts to perform miraculous, not very nice miraculous, but miraculous actions to prove his point, including, here we go, the ominous carob tree that shows up in the Honi story shows up in the Eliezer ben Hyrcanus story, where he lifts it up. He lifts up a huge carob tree, and we know these carob trees have been growing for 70 years, according to our Masechet and Bavli. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, the tree lifts itself up and threatens to be dropped on other people. A stream turns backwards, and what eventually happens? A bat hole comes and says, a voice from heaven comes and says, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is correct. All the other Hakamim are wrong. And that's when Rabbi Yeshua gets up and says, Lo b'shamayim, it is not in heaven. You cannot win an argument with a thought pole, with a carob tree, with a reverse stream. You have to use logic and you have to use the common language that we all understand. And at the end of that story, I won't go into the very end of the story, but Eliyahu shows up, you know, the ubiquitous Eliyahu, who never shows up the way he does in Tanakh, in rabbinic literature, but Rabbi Natan encounters Eliyahu and he says to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at the time when Rabbi Yeshua issued his declaration of Lo b'shamayim? And Eliyahu said to him, the Holy One smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me. And I think that the underlying message there is that God wants, and the message of Shimon ben Shetach is God's not looking for the miracle maker, the Ben Bayit he sees all the time. God's not looking for that. God's looking at us. God's looking for our communication, for our words, and for our maasim. And I think this connects so well with Daf Yomi in general. Michelle referred to this a couple of weeks ago, that when Rabbi Moshe ben Nachum Mendel Spivak came up with the idea of Daf Yomi, one of the goals was, let's have a world where Jews are speaking the same language. Let's have a world where Jews are able to communicate with each other. Because when they're able to communicate with each other, travel anywhere in the world and find someone and use this terminology and use this basis and use this logic to be able to communicate with each other, that's the power that leads to the Machol Tzadikim, that leads to that circle of Tzadikim, unified in action and unified in our hopes and dreams. You know, like we were dreamers, going back to the Pacific component. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you for the speakers, and thank you for Maggie for making all of this happen. And thank you for all being part of the learning. And as in the words that we learned today, Demosif Yosif. I think you all well understand how much the Daf Yomi learning and in general Gemara learning adds to our lives. Thank you, everyone. Everyone's unmuted now if you'd like to say something.
Okay.
Yasher koach, everybody.
Okay. Thank you. Excellent as always.
Thank you so much. It was really inspiring and meaningful. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sponsoring.
Toda rabba, mazal tov to everybody.
Mazal tov. Mazal tov.
So,
Beautiful.
thank you, everyone. It was
Beautiful,
fantastic.
Siyum. Thank you so much. And thank you, Rella, for sponsoring.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great.
Till the next Siyum, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was incredible.
Thank you.